Well, good evening, everyone. Good to see all of you. Hope that you're having a good week so far. That atomic clock is atomically off. It says 2:11, so it's not very helpful at all. So I'm going to be looking down at my phone. I'm not texting. I'm just checking the time. I'm going to get right into our class tonight as we start to study His Word. Before we do, of course, we want to go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, we praise your name. We thank you so much for a good week so far and for the ability we have to come together and encourage one another and to study your word and to grow closer to you. Help us to learn from the examples of both good and bad in your word, and help us to emulate Christ in all that we do and all that we say. Help us to glorify you more and more with each day that passes. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So last class we entered the spiritual bizarro world of Judges 17 through 21. It's a series of chapters designed to show us what happens when man makes himself the standard and does away with God. There is a refrain that is repeated over and over again in these chapters, and what is that refrain?
Everyone did what was right in their sight.
Yeah, there was no king in Israel, and so everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now, do you think that that's just like a pro-monarchy sort of statement? Like the writer was thinking, once we get a king in the land, well, then that's the solution. Is that really what you think is going on with that statement?
Not at all.
I don't think so either. I think the point is ultimately they've rejected God as their king. Because even when they get a physical king, it's not like people stopped doing what was right in their own eyes. In fact, even the kings started doing what was right in their own eyes. So really this is a statement about them not submitting to God as their ultimate standard in the land. And in terms of the narrative of the book of Judges, these final chapters show just how morally confused and how morally depraved the Israelites have become. What you really realize when you read these chapters, they don't just become like the Canaanites. They become worse than the Canaanites. And there are a lot of little clues that the narrator gives to us to make that point. So in chapter 17, we read about this idolatrous thief named Micah who stole from his own mother. And he invented his own religion. He hired his own personal Levite as a priest and actually thought God would be pleased with him. And even the priest that Micah hired seemed to have no concern for God, only about his own well-being and personal interests. And we're going to kind of read a continuation of that account of Micah and this priest in chapter 18 when we talk about the migration of the Danites. Look with me real quick in Joshua 19. There was a bit of a typo in Waldron's book, but it's Joshua 19. The book said Joshua 10. It's Joshua 19 in verse 47. Here the land had been allotted to the tribes, and this is describing the allotment of the tribe of Dan in Joshua 19 in verse 47. Joshua 19 verse 47, the territory of the sons of Dan proceeded beyond them. In other words, it proceeded beyond what had been allotted to them. For the sons of Dan went up and fought with Leshem and captured it. Then they struck it with the edge of the sword and possessed it and settled in it. And they called Leshem Dan, after the name of Dan, their father. Now apparently Leshem is just kind of an alternate spelling of the same city, Laish. And that's what we read about in Judges 18. That this verse in Joshua 19:47 is expanded on and given to us in more detail about how it was that their border was kind of expanded beyond them by capturing the city of Laish. That's what happens in Judges 18. Now turn to Judges chapter 1. Judges chapter 1. Because there's another important point to make about the Danites here. A lot of Judges chapter 1 is explaining how the tribes failed to drive out their enemies from the land. Well, Judges 1 verse 34 says the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the valley. So apparently the Danites were kind of crowded in their land because the Amorites were still pressuring them to only stay in the hill country but not really down in the plain, in the flat parts. Here's a question. What does this fact that a portion of them were kind of driven out by the Amorites, teach us about the Danites spiritually? What does Judges 1:34 say about them spiritually?
They didn't turn to God.
Yeah, they
would have
didn't.
been saved.
Yeah, they didn't trust the Lord. The point is, the whole mission of coming into the land was be strong and courageous. Trust me, I'll drive out your enemies. So when you read something like Judges 1:34, it shows the Danites could not fully drive out the Amorites. And instead, they let the Amorites drive a portion of them out. And that's what we're seeing in Judges 18, is their cowardice. Instead of standing to fight against the Amorites and taking the territory that rightfully belongs to them by the Lord, well, some of them are going to go look for an easier place to rest their head. And that's going to happen in this chapter with Laish. So let's get into Judges 18 then. In verse 1. Verse 1, in those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for themselves to live in, for until that day an inheritance had not fallen to them as a possession among the tribes of Israel. This verse has just created a lot of debate in the scholarly community, what's going on here, because it almost makes it sound like this event happens before the allotment in Joshua. But that's not really fair to what the text says. In fact, the translators in the New American Standard says, until that day an inheritance had not been allotted to them. But really, literally, the phrase means had not fallen to them. So translators have kind of filled in the allotment part, but when you see the chronology of Joshua and Judges, you see actually the land had been allotted to them, but I think the point is it hadn't fallen to them in the sense that they've not really fully taken possession of that land. And that's explained because the Amorites are driving them out. So they're going to leave and go somewhere else. And I also say that the land had already been allotted to them because some of them were already living in that land. Look at verse 2. It says, so the sons of Dan sent from their family 5 men out of their whole number, valiant men from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and go search it. And they said to them, go search the land. And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. What I want you to see is that some of the Danites were already living in Zorah and Eshtaol. Eshtaol is not on this map, but it's just northeast of Zorah there. So they are actually in the land of Dan. In fact, earlier in Judges, Samson's parents are from Zorah. So what this shows is they have a part of the land, but again, because of the oppression of the Amorites, they're gonna try to go up north to the city of Laish, which is way, way, way up here to the north. And you can see Dan there down in the southwest is the normal allotment, but they're going to go up and take this city of Laish way, way up north. Let's get into the text now. I know that was a lot of background, but I just want you to make sure that we understand what's going on in the big picture. Let's read then verses 3 through 10 and find out how this goes. When they were near the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young man, the Levite. They turned aside there and said to him, who brought you here? And what are you doing in this place? And what do you have here? He said to them, thus and so Micah has done to me, and he has hired me, and I have become his priest. They said to him, inquire of God, please, that we may know whether our way on which we are going will be prosperous. The priest said to them, go in peace. Your way in which you are going has the Lord's approval. Then the 5 men departed and came to Laish, and saw the people who were in it living securely after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure, for there was no ruler humiliating them for anything in the land, and they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. And when they came back to their brothers at Zorah and Eshtaol, their brothers said to them, what do you report? And they said, arise and let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And will you sit still? Do not delay to go to enter to possess the land. And when you enter, you will come to a secure people with a spacious land, for God has given it into your hand, a place where there is no lack of anything that is on the earth. Question, does any of this sound familiar to something we read earlier in Israelite history?
Joshua.
Yeah. Here are these people, they're sending in spies to spy out the land. But remember, this is like the Twilight Zone, right? This is like backwards, bizarre world where everything is kind of upside down. So think about you might see that comparison. It looks kind of like the earlier issue with Joshua and the spies, but think of the differences. Instead of inquiring of God, they inquire of this false priest. And when God told them back in Joshua's day to send faithful priests, when God sent faithful spies into the land and they came back and they said, hey, let's go. God gave us the land. At least Joshua and Caleb said that. The people rejected them. But here, they get a message from a false priest and everybody's excited about it. Hey, the land is ours. Let's take it. But God wasn't even really consulted. It doesn't even seem like the priest talked to God. They asked the priest, hey, what does the Lord say? And he said, well, hey, God says go in peace. Isn't it true sometimes when we want to hear what we want to hear, we don't really care where it comes from? Don't really consider the source. And they say, man, this guy, he told us it's going to work out. So let's go and take it. And now they're taking land that doesn't even really belong to them as well. God gave them land and they wouldn't take that. But they're going to make up their own land and they're all excited and gung-ho about going to take this city. I also find it interesting in verse 8 that these Canaanites in Laish, they seem to be living the life that the Israelites should have been living. Actually, verse 7. I said that wrong. Verse 7. These Canaanites are living the life that the Israelites should have been living. Restful, peaceful, free from humiliation from their enemies. Yet look at the Danites. So restless. So oppressed by their enemies that they're forced out of their own territory. And again, perhaps the Danites chose Laish because this was a much easier target than the Amorites that were plaguing them. We don't have that much courage. God says be strong and courageous. I think I'll take the easier route instead. So once the 5 spies really motivate and fire up the Danites, they set 600 warriors aside to go and conquer this city. But on their way, they stop at Micah's house. And what do the 5 spies counsel the Danites to do?
Take the idols and take the false prophet or the false priest.
Let's go into Micah's house. Let's take his idols and let's take his priest. Because kind of like the ark that we said about earlier, as long as we have these idols with us, as long as we have this priest with us, we're going to be victorious. And so you see that Micah, the thief, is now being stolen from. And when the priest notices that they're stealing from Micah, he says, hey, what's going on? Why are you guys stealing from him? This is not appropriate. But what do they say to calm him down or to get him on their side?
Come with us.
Yeah. Hey, why don't you just come with us instead and be our priest? And really fascinating, they say the exact same thing to him. It was like the magic words. The exact same thing to this priest that Micah said to him in chapter 17. Look in verse 19. In verse 19, they said to him, be silent, put your hand over your mouth, and come with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be a priest to the house of one man, or to be a priest to a tribe and a family in Israel? Again, he's invited to take this position of prominence so that people will look to him as this great spiritual advisor. And that just sounds so attractive to him. And then they basically just say, look, why be a priest for a small little house church when you can be the priest of the mega church of Dan? And he is all over that. Verse 20, the priest's heart was glad. And he took the ephod and household idols and the graven image. And so, did you see what just happened? He took them. So it's not just that the Danites stole the idols. Once this priest saw what was in it for him, he went and jumped in on that bandwagon and stole from Micah and left. And then Micah finds out. He chases them down to try to get his gods back that couldn't even defend themselves from being stolen. And the Danites tell him to beat it or we'll kill you. And he just goes back home like a dog with his tail between his legs. Isn't it and Danites destroyed Laish, installed this false priest, and Dan became a city filled with idolatry for centuries to come. Backwards. Bizarre. Everything is, it just doesn't make any sense how wicked these people can be. And I have some applications, and I want to open it up for comments at this point after I make these applications. First of all, if you ever meet a preacher who's motivated by money and fame, run. And if you're ever looking to hire a preacher and you want him to say certain things or do certain things for you, and the way that you're motivating him is with money and fame, don't go there. Don't go there. I also see just because you have earthly success in this life doesn't mean the Lord is with you. The Danites succeeded in defeating Laish. And you can imagine what the talk would have been. Well, hey, God gave us the victory. The priest told us we've got the Lord's approval. And look, it happened just like the priest said. And therefore, we're pleasing to God. You got to read His Word, not life events. Many people, they try to read life events to determine God's will for them. We need to read God's Word to determine His will for us, because life events are not always connected to whether or not God is pleased with us. And then I'll make this last point. The choices we make today can affect generations to come. Remember, the author of Judges could have appended snapshots of anyone's life in these 4 chapters, but he chose these characters specifically. His main focus is Ephraim and Judah and Dan. And when you read the rest of their history, you see that the United Kingdom will become divided between Ephraim in the north, because you'll have these 2 kings, these 2 rulers, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And Jeroboam is from Ephraim and Rehoboam is from Judah, and they'll split. And Ephraim, because it was one of the largest tribes in Israel, it will just become referred to as Israel. But what you see is Ephraim and Judah were sinful all the way back at this point in their history. And it continued all the way through the divided kingdom. And I think the reason, and again, I can't know this for sure, but I believe that it makes sense. The reasons he's focusing on Dan here is because of the perpetual idolatry that will go on in the city of Dan. In fact, when Jeroboam becomes king of the north, remember the 2 cities he sets up idol worship? It's Dan and Bethel. And you see that Micah the Ephraimite and this unfaithful priest from Judah and the Danites have all contributed to idolatry in the land that remained until the time of captivity. Verse 30. Verse 30 says, he and his sons were priests of the tribe of Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. There's some debate over, which captivity that's talking about, but I really believe that that's referring to the ultimate captivity of the Babylonians, but maybe even earlier than that, maybe the destruction of Israel, because of the idolatry that was going on in Dan. Questions or comments about Judges chapter 18? Mike?
Why do you think they put their kids and animals as human shields in front of them? Kind of like what Jacob did when they left.
Which verse are you referring to?
Well, it's right after you just got through reading in verse 21. After they take the idols and they go off to go on their adventure, they put their kids and their livestock and possessions in front of them.
That's a good question,
It's
Mike.
kind of like what Jacob did when he was going to go meet Esau.
Yeah, but the reverse, maybe. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know why they would do that. Maybe to keep an eye on them so they wouldn't lose them. I'm not sure. Maybe that's just the standard way to travel. I'm not sure. Joe?
Well, I was just thinking, but wasn't Micah coming from the south, so he was coming behind them, and maybe he wanted, maybe I've got my directions completely wrong, maybe he wants to have the warriors, back behind them, so when they come up after him, because they're going to the north, So they would want them behind them, which would be to the south of the group. I mean, that's just speculation.
Yeah, I have no
But
idea.
I thought, what Mike did, I thought, well, why are they doing that? But I just thought, well, maybe they would attack from their rear, so they wanted the fighting men to the rear, having the other people up to the north, as they would go up towards Dan.
I guess, but I mean, but if they're up north, they're gonna, Laish would come from the north to attack. So, yeah, I have no idea. I can look it up later, but I really don't know.
But I was
Terry?
talking about Micah.
Micah.
Because remember, Micah said, well, I'll go after them. Before they ever got to, up to.
Oh, I see what your point is. Oh, I see. So they're worried about retaliation from Micah.
Yeah, because they stole all of his stuff.
Maybe, but they've got a huge army, and
Yeah.
they don't seem very afraid of Michael either. They just tell him to beat it, get lost. Terry?
Terrorists will set up base camps and hospitals and elementary schools so that we don't attack. That was my first thought, is let's kind of slow down.
Yeah, I've got a footnote that said, for protection in case of attack, and I don't know if this is a thing that they do, but it would slow them down so the fighting men could form some sort of strategy. If they're out in front, it would be chaos. Maybe it's a way to see it coming and slow it down and then get to them.
Could be. I have no idea. I appreciate the thoughts, but I just can't say much on that.
Aren't the Danites, don't they just kind of become a sort of hiss and a byword throughout the teachings? They just, it seems like there were other verses, I didn't do a research on it, but there's references to the Danites and how the sinful people, they sort of do their own thing, do what they want to do, and they'll say like the Danites did.
Maybe, yeah. I'd have to check on that too. Yeah, certainly that's where the idolatry was centered in the northern kingdom of Israel. So it makes sense. But I don't remember a specific verse that says like the Danites. So.
Okay, and then secondly, this priest is just like you said. It's just really weird. He has no integrity, no loyalty, no fidelity, and then it says, I know you haven't quite got to this, but they steal an idol to worship. I mean, how bizarre is that? Stealing an idol to worship it. I mean, if you think about that for just 3 seconds, it might occur to somebody that maybe this doesn't really make any sense.
Maybe this idol isn't that great. And allows it to be stolen from its owner.
What's the deal with that?
Yeah, it's so backwards, and that's what we're supposed to see. We're supposed to scratch our heads in disbelief when we read this. This is what happens when people leave God. Jack, and then we have to move on.
Brian, I think it shows how utterly corrupt Israel was in its completeness, because they talk about the land being from Dan to Beersheba. They understood the land that was given to them was in the south, and yet they are calling that land in the north Dan, because the Danites moved there. It wasn't the right thing to do, it wasn't the good thing to do, and yet the people accepted it.
Yeah, absolutely. You make a great point. It's very, very corrupt. Okay, Jim. Last comment on this. Go ahead.
Well, question actually.
Okay.
Is this Micah the same Micah as the prophet?
It is not. It is not. Thankfully. Well, I don't know. It'd be nice to see this Micah repent and become that Micah, but yeah, that's going to happen much, much later in history. Yeah, good question though. So let's keep going, because in Judges 19, we're going to read about one of the most heinous sins in all of Scripture, and we see that both Ephraim and Judah are involved again with this Levite and the concubine. You have a Levite who's in the hill country of Ephraim, and he had a concubine who was a second-class wife, basically. Apparently, she cheated on him or was unfaithful to him, and maybe he waited around for 4 months, or maybe he just hardened his heart against her for 4 months. I'm not sure. But after 4 months goes by, he goes to chase her and to win her back. And he goes to her father's house, and her father welcomes him in and is just very hospitable. And apparently they kind of made up, him and his concubine, and they were getting along, and everything was just great. In fact, he wanted to leave, but the father wouldn't let him. It was kind of like back in Genesis with Laban and his daughters, and not wanting them to leave yet. And it's just wonderful picture of hospitality to open this chapter, which perhaps is the contrast with the lack of hospitality in the rest of this chapter. Let's pick up in verse 10. 10 through 15. Judges 19, 10 through 15. But the man was not willing to spend the night, so he arose and departed and came to a place opposite Jabus, that is Jerusalem. And there were with him a pair of saddled donkeys. His concubine also was with him. And when they were near Jabus, the day was almost gone. And the servant said to his master, "Please come and let us turn aside into this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." However, his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who are not of the sons of Israel, but we will go on as far as Gibeah." And he said to his servant, "Come and let us approach one of these places, and we will spend the night in Gibeah or Ramah." So they passed along and went their way, and the sun set on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there in order to enter and lodge in Gibeah. But when they entered, they sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. It's hard to really fathom how terrible this part of the story is. We haven't even really gotten to the worst part, but this is awful, what's happening right now. They didn't have Motel 6s back then, so when you're traveling through a town, you were supposed to invite travelers into your home. That was just part of your responsibility as a citizen in that town. And yet, here is this man and his servant and his wife and his animals, and they're just sitting out in the open town square. And not a single person is inviting them in. It really is such a sad commentary about where they're at. Powerful verse. In Leviticus 19, it says this, verse 33 and 34, "When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger who resides with you, shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." How far is this chapter from Leviticus 19? And we're already kind of seeing this as they're sitting all alone out in this town square. And the servant wants to stop in Jerusalem, and the man says, "No, we really shouldn't stop in Jerusalem." So they were down in Bethlehem. You can see Bethlehem there, the north part of Judah, and they're traveling up north. And the servant says, "Hey, let's stop in Jerusalem." And he says, "No, we probably shouldn't go there. We should just keep traveling, and we'll either stay in Gibeah or in Ramah somewhere." Why do you think the man didn't want to stop in Jerusalem?
They were not his brethren.
Okay, they were not his brethren. That's true. He does say, well, because they're not sons of Israel. Maybe a more specific question, what did he mean by that? Why is that such a big deal?
He was expecting hospitality.
Okay, yeah, so he was thinking, if we stay with these foreign people, you never know what might happen to you staying with people who have no morals and who don't serve Yahweh as their God. And look at the irony. They go to Gibeah, thinking that they're going to stay with their brethren, as Jack said, and yet they come to people with no morals because they are not serving Yahweh. So their own people show them zero hospitality. And remember, by the way, this is a Levite, right? He's a spiritual leader of the people, and the people aren't even taking care of a Levite, which says something. It's kind of in contrast to Judges 17 with Micah's hospitality. He takes a Levite in, right? But even, again, that's twisted and that's backwards, because that wasn't really hospitable. That was self-serving and wicked. But in verse 16 and 17, continue on, "Then behold, an old man was coming out of the field from his work at evening. And now the man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was staying in Gibeah, but the men of the place were Benjamites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, 'Where are you going, and where do you come from?'" So this old man, who is not even from Benjamin, invites these people into his home. And interestingly, the Levite tells them, "Look, we're fine. We've got enough provisions. We're fine out here in the street." And yet he insists. And things seem to be going so well until they hear a knock at the door. And men from the city surround his house, demand that he send this Levite out so that they can sexually abuse him. So not only do the people in this town not provide hospitality for their guests, they brutalize their guests, even in homosexual ways. And so the Levite, this supposed spiritual leader of God's people, in order to save his own skin, says, here, take this concubine instead. This concubine that, by the way, he just went to her father's house to win her back, because apparently he cared enough about her to at least win her over, and now he throws her out to the wolves, and they abuse her all night until she dies. And then this Levite gets up in the morning, presumably after getting a good night's sleep in a warm bed, and he sees her on the threshold, and instead of just running to her and embracing her, and he coldly says, get up and let's go. And that's when he realized she was dead. It's one of the most difficult stories in the Bible to read. I get so angry. I can barely contain myself when I read this account. It's just absolutely infuriating. And I'm thinking, if it's kind of like when Jesus says, if you being evil know how to give good gifts to your parents, how much more God? If I being evil am getting angry at a story like this, how angry do you think God is at an atrocity like this in His Word? And when you read this account, what can you not help thinking about in terms of what we've read earlier in the Bible? Sound familiar at all? Yeah, Lot and what happened at Sodom. Judges 19, Genesis 19. Easy way to remember that. In that case, the men surrounded the city, wanted to sodomize the angels that were staying with Lot. And in that case, the angels intervened and struck those men blind. But then remember, after Sodom, reached that point, God says, that's it. It's over for the city. They are doomed for destruction. And here, the Benjamites have rejected Yahweh as their king. They have become Sodom. And now they're about to be destroyed as well. And the man cuts this woman up into 12 pieces, sends her out so that all the tribes of Israel will know the atrocity committed by the men of Gibeah and Benjamin. And now in chapter 20, you have this civil war against Benjamin. Everybody rises up against them, 400,000 foot soldiers. Look down with me in verse 11 and verse 8, and then verse 18. Look at verse 11 of chapter 20. I'm just going to make a couple more points and open it up for comments, questions. Verse 11, thus all the men of Israel were gathered against the city, united as one man. And then drop down to verse 18. Now the sons of Israel arose, went up to Bethel, and inquired of God and said, who shall go up first for us to battle against the sons of Benjamin? And then the Lord said, Judah shall go up first. So again, I want you to see in this spiritual bizarro world what has happened at the end of Judges. Look at the unity of the Israelites in the moral outrage of the sin, so much so that they're willing to unite and fight together to remove the wickedness from their midst. But what's the irony? What's the backward part? What's that, Joe?
I said they asked God.
Okay, they asked God that. Okay, yeah, but what's the irony about them uniting to fight against wickedness here?
If they had done that earlier, there wouldn't have been any evil people in the world.
Okay, yeah. They should have been doing that against the Canaanites, but they're doing it against their own people because their own people have become just as sinful as the Canaanites. In fact, look how Judges opens. Look in the first two verses of Judges. Judges chapter 1. I want you to see this parallel. Judges chapter 1, this is when they're supposed to be, first going in and fighting the Canaanites. And it's all very exciting. And look at verse 1. Judges 1:1, it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. You see that textual parallel there? It's almost the exact same wording, except this time in Judges 20, it's the Benjamites and not the Canaanites. It's absolutely tragic that the Benjamites have become so much like the Canaanites that the Israelites have unified together to destroy their own people. And here's my question. While they're fighting against each other, what are they not doing? Who are they not fighting against?
Not fighting the Canaanites.
The Canaanites. The very people that they're supposed to be fighting, that they came to the land to fight. They are the real enemies. one of Satan's favorite strategies in the church, in God's kingdom, is to get us to sin against each other so that we're too busy fighting against one another to fight against the real enemy. And it doesn't take some outrageously heinous sin like in Judges 19. Sometimes it can be something small. Even a little leaven leavens the whole lump, and Satan can get us so distracted from our real mission and our real task. Any comments or questions so far on Judges 19 and maybe the first part of chapter 20? Terry?
The evil is so pervasive that, I mean, I understand a small group of people wanting to do something like that, okay, but the leaders of the entire tribe stood up for these men. And it was so bad, against really an insurmountable odds. They're fighting all the rest of the tribe. And I can't fathom what their justification for doing that is.
Yeah, so you're bringing up a great point, because when they come to fight against the Benjamites, they should have just handed over the men of Gibeah. But instead, they put their family ties before God. And they said, we're gonna stick up for our brethren because they're fellow Benjamites, instead of really putting them to death like the law of Moses called for. And this again goes to the backwards nature of this whole thing. And God eventually gives them, we're running out of time, so I can't really talk in detail about the battle, but God gives the Israelites victory over Benjamin, and Benjamin's destroyed to the point of only having 600 men left. And chapter 21 is all about them rebuilding the tribe of Benjamin. They almost kind of blame God, God, how could you let this happen? And now they're kind of going back on what they originally planned to do, and they're saying, how come, you let Benjamin almost be destroyed? And the view I take here, there's differing views. I think I'm right about this, but some say, they're right, that Benjamin, shouldn't be destroyed and that they should be rebuilding, and it shows mercy and grace and maybe even God's grace. I don't really take that view. As backwards as this whole section is and how everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes, it seems to me they should have finished the job and destroyed Benjamin altogether. They aligned themselves with the sinful men of Gibeah. They made themselves guilty along with those men when they defended them. They were worthy of destruction like Sodom. But it seems like they're too soft in their dealings, just like they'd been too soft in their dealings with the Canaanites and letting them kind of live and have their own little thing. Here they're doing the same thing with the Benjamites and leaving a remnant of them, and now they're actually helping them. And so their mission, they don't even inquire of God, really. I mean, they sacrifice to him, but they don't say, God, what should we do? They just come up with their own solutions. And they say, look, there's 600 Benjamite men left. We need to find 600 women for them, but there's a problem because, hey, we vowed not to give our women to them, which, again, is an allusion back to Deuteronomy 7. They're not supposed to intermarry with the Canaanites because they'd be led into idolatry. And here, they're not intermarrying with the Benjamites because they're afraid of, what will happen. So it's kind of another Canaanite-Benjamite connection there. But they find ways around this vow. We vowed not to give our wives to them, so you know what we're going to do? We realize there's a city up north, Jabesh Gilead. They never came to battle, which means they never made that vow. So we're going to go and destroy them, their women, their children, and then we're going to take the virgins, 400 virgins from them. So in order to support a tribe that supported the murdering of a woman, they're going to go and murder a bunch of other women and steal 400 virgins. This is their solution. And they don't have the final 200. They still need 200 more. So they tell the men of Benjamin to kidnap women who, maybe are on their way to the tabernacle. And then if their fathers find out about it, technically they haven't violated their oath because they didn't technically give them their women. Their women were stolen from them. So it's a word play. It's a verbiage thing. We'll get out of our vow. And so now again, ironically, they destroyed the Benjamites for siding with men who basically kidnapped a woman. And now they're telling the Benjamites to kidnap these women. And that's why you have the final verse, a perfect way to end Judges. There's no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And again, I'm not sure if it was God's will that Benjamin actually be rebuilt. I don't think it was, but I do find this last thing very interesting. When the people ask for a king, like all the nations, guess where God takes their king from? Benjamin. Just find that interesting. Don't know what to make of it. Maybe there's something to it, but I do find it interesting that Saul comes from Benjamin. when perhaps Benjamin should have been destroyed for their sinfulness. Sorry I didn't leave enough time. That was just so much material I had to get through. But thank you very much for your comments and thoughts. And we'll pick up in Ruth Sunday. Oh, I've got the pages here. That's page 132 of your book.